Today, I am Christine Caseres and I'm here to present the affected areas of COVID-19 pandemic. So, based on the topics provided, I choose economic systems. Why I choose economic systems? Because we all know that economic systems is is the areas which is affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So, let me define first what is economic systems. An economic system is an organized way in which a country allocates resources and distributes goods and services across the whole nation. Also, economic systems define how goods and services are produced, distributed, and at what price. So, these are the cause and effects of economic systems which are affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Let us proceed to variables of economic systems. So, the first variable is widespread economic losses. During this pandemic, the economic crisis unleashed by the outbreak of COVID-19 was hurting economies regardless of income level. The second variable is lower income. During this pandemic, the events severely affect firms in lower income countries due to their poor economic conditions and their weak capacity to respond to crisis. Next is crisis. During this pandemic, the crisis was increased and it can cause indirect losses on economy. Next is payment of wages. During this pandemic, the payment of wages seems to be more problematic for small and medium and small of firms. The next variable is market shocks. When we say market shocks, during this pandemic, market shocks it is important to distinguish the three sources, or two of which are tangible. So, first are the purely medical stocks like workers in their sick beds aren't producing GDP. Second is the economic impact of public and private containment measures, things like school and factory closures, travel restrictions, and quarantines. So, the third is literally in all our heads. Variable is difficulty in financing. So, during this pandemic, difficulty in financing are less relevant for medium, large, and large firms. Variable is supply. During this pandemic, supply has a supply shocks, which is supply shocks aspects of COVID-19, factory closures, travel bans, border closings, and the like will reduce exports of affected sectors in affected nations. So, for example, exports from China have already been severely hit by the virus and COVID-19. To various media reports, official figures are available only after a several month or delay. Also, supply shocks in one nation or in one industry within a nation become a supply shock in other industry into the making of something that being supplied is an input of the market. And next is confidence. So, confidence is important during this pandemic because nowadays severely hit by the COVID-19. Another variable that is affected by the COVID-19 is value chain disruption. So, value chain disruption triggered by the COVID-19 crisis represent a far more pressing problem. Next variable is demand. When we say demand, during this pandemic has a side like shocks, and when it comes to COVID-19, immediate aggregate demand shock worth distinguishing practical and psychological. There is a practical aspect since some consumers are or will be prevented from getting to stores, so their demand disappears from the market. Likewise, some home delivery services are suspended. So, goods and consumers are coming together less frequently. Variable is policy. Policy are not implemented well by the government. Next is economic shocks. Economic shocks during this pandemic are affected and also seems like a market shocks that are affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So, next variable is trade flows susceptible. So, during this pandemic, trade flows susceptible that international trade is surely one of the leading mechanisms through which the use damages domestic economics and spread international. Trade happens when things are made in one nation and purchased in another. This quiet naturally makes trade flow susceptible. So, demand shocks, which means purchases fall, and supply shocks, which means production falls. So, those are the variables of economic systems. Let us proceed to the heat map of this system, which is economic. So, more widespread economic losses, more economic shocks will happen, and more lower income, less supply will happen. Next is crisis. More crisis, less demand. Payment of wages, less payment of wages, more crisis will happen. Market shocks, um, less demand, more market shocks.
Bakit yan?
More difficulty in financing, more value chain disruption. And next is lower income, more lower income, less supply. Less confidence, less policy will happen. And more economic shocks will be more trade flow susceptible. So, these are the heat map of the economic system. Proceed to the reinforcing and balancing loop of the economic systems which is affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. These three variables are the most important variables that is affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. The more market shocks, the more demand. The more demand, the more supply. In order to create a balancing and reinforcing loop, we will use arrows to represent action. The more supply, the less demand. The more demand, the more market shocks. So, the arrows on the upper part represent delays, which means it takes time to happen. So, this is the balancing and reinforcing loop of economic systems which is affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Therefore, policies must be implemented well to protect these variables and devastation of COVID-19 mostly in economic systems. And that's all. Thank you. God bless.